2 minutes. Bom dia a todos. Começamos então a nossa última sessão do nosso 15º encontro, hoje com a palestra, com a conferência do professor Massimo Ferrari. Good morning, you all. We're starting our final session of our 15th meeting with the conference by Professor Massimo Ferrari from University of Turin. And afterwards, we will have comments by Professor Ernesto Giusti from UNICEF. So, Professor Massimo, thank you so very much for your kindness and your presence and your patience this morning. And please, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much to you. I apologize for the impossibility to reach the meeting personally, but I have some problems, and it would be very, very interesting to have the possibility to be here with you. And I try to hold my lecture with the help of the PowerPoint. I have chosen also some quotation that would be highlighting my exposition. And you see, the title of my talk is Hans Reichenbach and the Theory of Relativity in France. Next slide. Hans Reichenbach. And you find the articulation of my paper in the next slide. Is an introduction, then the story of a neglected article, and then the other part of this talk. I start with the introduction. During the 20s, Hans Reichenbach devoted a great deal of his intellectual energy to the discussion of the theory of relativity. Reichenbach not only promoted an original interpretation, first outlined in his 1920 book Relativität und Erkenntnis a priori, and further developed in 1824 through the highly sophisticated attempt of axiomatization the theory of space-time, but he also vigorously defended Einstein's theory against the attacks that on various fronts were directed at it, in a context in which, in Germany, but not only in Germany, Einstein's theory was omnipresent, even in public opinion. See the wonderful book by Watzek, 2009. And not a significant part of this activity Reichenbach devoted to popularizing the theory of relativity through writings that were not strictly technical, but rather intended for readers unaware or ill-informed of what had profoundly changed in the traditional context of space, time, light, and gravitation. In this polemical activity, Reichenbach distinguished himself by his expository skills, his conceptual precision, and his ability to translate the fundamental principles of contemporary physics into accessible language. For these reasons, Reichenbach has been effectively called the Einstein Bulldog. Indeed, one need only to recall, in addition to the recent collection of articles published under the title Defending Einstein, the first volume of his selected writings, the 1927 small volume entitled The Von Copernicus to Einstein, or finally the text of the radio lectures collected in 1930 in Atom und Cosmos, to get an idea of the extraordinary importance of this part of Reichenbach's philosophical work. Reichenbach was well aware that the effort in popularizing science was strictly tied to the proper task of scientific philosophy, to promote the modernization of contemporary culture, a task he perceived to be of the greatest importance, in particular during the years of the Weimar Republic. In Reichenbach's wide production devoted to popularizing and understanding a correct interpretation of the theory of relativity, the long article published in French in July 1922 in the Revue philosophique de la France et de l'étranger under the title La signification.
Let's wait for him getting back. I think his internet connection is pretty bad.
Okay.
Okay. Probably you had some internet issues, so okay, we're back.
But it's the first time internet for okay.
Okay, just let me know when you want to go through another slide. Just say next. I can pass for you.
Okay, the next slide. Okay. You find the title of Reichenbach's essay of 1922 and other text that I have quoted and I am quoting during my lecture. And the text of this article, I mean the article in French, is not reprinted in volume 3 of Reichenbach's Gesammelte Werke, nor does it appear in the selected writings. Moreover, it has sometimes been mistakenly regarded as a French translation of the older and much better known article that came out in 1821 in Logos, Der gegenwärtige Stand der Relativitätsdiskussion, or it has been confused with the contribution in English that Reichenbach wrote in 1849 for the volume devoted to Einstein in the Library of Living Philosophers, which in fact bears the same title as they say of more than 24 years earlier, The Philosophical Significance of the Theory of Relativity. In fact, the 1922 French article is not only an original work that Reichenbach wrote specifically for the Revue philosophique de la France et de l'étranger, but it belongs to a context that has been essentially ignored or only remembered in passing, even by scholars interested in the reception of the theory of relativity in France in the 20s. For this reason, the neglected history of Reichenbach's paper deserves to be told in more detail, and this is precisely the aim of my talk. Next slide. Before starting the story, it is first appropriate to recall that the year 1922 was a kind of annus mirabilis for the reception of the theory of relativity in France. In February, Paul Langevin had invited Einstein to give a lecture at the Collège de France, renewing an invitation that had already been extended to him and accepted by Einstein in 1930. But following, Einstein's was had been postponed until better times. In 1822, however, the project was realized. But Einstein's visit to Paris had been preceded by heated controversy. While in Germany, the pacifist and Jewish scientist who was ready to travel to the land of the enemy, who had inflicted the humiliation of the Versailles Treaties, was considered a traitor, In France, the arrival of the Bosch Einstein, even though Einstein was a staunch pacifist, and moreover, he had the Swiss citizenship, aroused hostility within the academic community, which was still sensitive to the harsh contrast of the wartime with Germany's and the ideas of 1914. Einstein, for his part, had initially declined an invitation, but returned to his fifth text in part to the urging he received from Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister of the young Weimar Republic, who saw in the Paris meeting a propitious chance to restore cultural relations between France and Germany after the end of a devastating conflict. Between March 31 and April 7, Einstein gave 4 lectures at the Collège de France, while the lecture at the Académie des Sciences scheduled for April 4 was cancelled because Einstein did not want to expose himself to the boycott that had been announced. But the clue of the Paris visit was the meeting with Einstein at the Sorbonne, organized by the Société Française de Philosophie on April 6, an event that soon became legendary and was attended by such distinguished philosophers and scientists as Paul Langevin, Émile Merson, Léon Brunswick, Jean Becquerel, Jean Perrin, Édouard Leroy, and, last but not least, Henri Bergson. For a long time, the very exchange of ideas between Einstein and Bergson has been considered the highlight of the discussion that took place in the elegant hall of the Sorbonne. And Einstein's words in response to Bergson's have appeared as the acknowledgement of an unbridgeable distance between the physicist and the philosopher. Next slide, please. This is the bulletin de Société Française de Philosophie, where the intervention at the meeting at the Sorbonne were published just in 1922. And next slide again. Einstein Italie, la théorie de la relativité, bulletin de la Société Française de Philosophie, and then the core issue, Einstein versus Bergson. To Bergson's attempt to consider the point of view of the réel as the necessary completion of the notion of simultaneity in the sense of relativity theory, Einstein had come out in a statement that would have remained famous. There is no time for the philosopher. There is only a psychological time different from the time of the physicist. However, Bergson is not Einstein's only interlocutor worthy of reading more than a century after April 6, 1922. No less important were the interventions both of Meyerson, who urged Einstein to clarify his position vis-à-vis Mach, and Léon Brunswick, who tried to explain why the general theory of relativity imposed the rethinking of the Kantian theory of knowledge in the light of the correlation between the mathematical and physical domains, to say between the space-time continuum and the reality that determines its characteristics. To Brunswick, in particular, Einstein replied, next slide, with the statement that has remained famous, all too often quoted out of context, that, I quote, every philosopher has his own Kant. And Einstein Kant in Paris was placed in relation to, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say in competition with, Poincaré. I quote, "What seems to me the most important in Kant's philosophy is that one speaks of an a priori concepts in order to construct science. Now, two points of view can be contrasted. The a priorism of Kant, in which certain concepts pre-exist in our consciousness, and the conventionalism of Poincaré. These 2 points of view agree on the point that science needs, in order to be constructed, arbitrary concepts. But as to whether these concepts are given a priori or arbitrary conventions, I can say nothing. End of quotation. Next slide. But let us now leave the Collège de France and then Sorbonne. In the days of Einstein's Paris visit, both Bergson du Ré-Simultanéité and Léon Brunswick's L'expérience humaine et la causalité physique did not still have seen the light, and in fact both the works would be published early in the following months. However, it is needless to stress how much Bergson's book would have then dominated the scene of the discussion of the theory of relativity in France in the early 20s. Less well known, by contrast, is that in Brunswick's huge book, 2 large chapters were devoted to the revolution accomplished by Einstein, comparable to Copernicus' astronomical one and to the Kantian revolution with regard to the theory of knowledge. At any rate, Bergson and Brunswick, even with all their authority, by no means exhaust the wide spectrum of the French discussion on the theory of relativity, which in 1822 experienced an increasing growth and was also motivated by the translation of some texts both of Einstein himself and by relativists such as Arthur Eddington and Hermann. In the Mare Magnum of next slide. In the Mare Magnum of the Einsteinian wave in France in 1822, however, the July-August issue of the Revue de Philosophie de la France et de l'étranger is worthy of particular attention. In that issue, 4 essays on the theory of relativity were published. The authors were Georges Cerf, a mathematician who taught at the University of Strasbourg, Edmond Goblet, who taught philosophy at the University of Dijon, also cultivating sociological studies, and Émile Richard Foy, a military scientist, who in the review would publish another article on Einstein conspired in 1824. It should be added that the following September-October issue would also host a long article by Abel Rey on the notion of object in relation to the development of contemporary physics. However, what is more striking is that the article inaugurating this series of papers in Lévi-Brux's journal was precisely Reichenbach's one, for whom the place of honor was reserved. And it is here that begins properly our story. Next slide for following section of my talk. The story of a neglected article. It was Einstein who had suggested Reichenbach's name as a competent author of an essay devoted to the illustration of the theory of relativity. And here again, we are dealing with a little prehistory that sheds light on Einstein's contact with French scientific philosophical culture in the early 20s. On November 17, 1921, Henri Barbus had written to Einstein to ask him to publish a contribution in the journal Clarté, which he had founded in 1921 as an expression of the eponymous group of left-wing intellectuals close to the cause of Bolshevism and the French Communist Party, undertaking his activity already in May 1929. It does not seem that Barbus intended to ask Einstein for an essay on the theory of relativity. And in fact, Einstein merely sent in for publication in Clarté a short text on pacifism. But this contact was followed a few weeks later by another invitation that reached Einstein from Paris. This time, it was Lucien Lévy-Bruhl who wrote to Einstein on December 23, 1921, to ask him for an article that would contrast the misconceptions circulating in France about his theory. However, in the early days of January 1922, Einstein replied that he was not interested in committing himself to a subject on which, I quote, too many wars have been wasted, and that someone else could do it better than he. Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, widely known as an anthropologist and scholar of primitive mentality, was the editor of the Revue philosophique de la France de l'étranger, a role he had inherited after the death in 1816 of the journal's founder and previous editor, Théodule Ribot, one of the most eminent representatives of French positivism in the late 19th century, who founded the journal in 1866. Until 1993, when a major new philosophy periodical, namely the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale, appeared, Ribot's journal represented the most influential French philosophical journal, well known also abroad. Both convergence and competition characterized the life of the journals since the early days of the founding of the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale. Next slide. And the latter, for his part, would indeed occupy an increasingly central place in the French philosophical landscape. Nonetheless, Lévy-Bruhl's journal remained an influential forum for philosophical discussion even in the 20s, particularly with regard to the relationship between science and philosophy. It is in this broader context that we have to place the proposal made by Lévy-Bruhl to Einstein, and by contrast, Einstein's decision to ask Reichenbach to write an article offering a rigorous account of the theory of relativity. In this regard, the letters sent by Lévy-Bruhl to Reichenbach between April and July 1922 are an indispensable document for reconstructing the genesis of Reichenbach's article. All these letters, which I quote, are unpublished letters. They are conserved in Reichenbach estate in Pittsburgh. On April 5, 1922, also the day before the debate organized at the Sorbonne by the Société Française de Philosophie, Lévy-Bruhl wrote to Reichenbach that he had just met with Einstein, who had proposed to him a possible, excellent author capable of writing the article. The author Einstein had in mind was precisely Reichenbach. For his part, Lévy-Bruhl declared himself fully satisfied with this solution and wrote to Reichenbach that he would be particularly happy to publish, I quote, a philosophical interpretation of relativity which has received the formal approval of its admirable author. Reichenbach, in turn, not only accepted Lévy-Bruhl's invitation, but drew up the article very quickly, and as early as May 29, 1922, Lévy-Bruhl could communicate to him that the article had just arrived in Paris and would be immediately translated into French. You see the letter, some of the letter I have quoted. Next slide, please. And this is the quotation I gave from the letter Lévy-Bruhl to Reichenbach. And now comes another protagonist of the story. Charged with the task of translating the German text of Reichenbach was Leon Bloch, a scholar now mostly forgotten, but at the time fairly well known because of a book on La Philosophie de Newton that appeared in 1908. On Bloch, it is worth spending a few words. A student of the École Normale, Bloch had obtained his aggregation in philosophy in 1899 and belonged to the intellectual milieu that counted among its ranks Boutroux, Braunschweig, Couturat, Lalande, and more generally, the group pivoting around the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale and the Société Française de Philosophie. The book on Newton presents an interpretation of Newton still tied to the cliché of Newton's positivism, resting both on his mathematical empiricism and his pragmatic conception of mathematics. In any case, it is a very thorough investigation, appreciated by scholars such as Braunschweig and later Cassirer, and which was extensively reviewed by Gaston Milhaud, who criticized, however, the supposed revolution accomplished by Newton with respect to Cartesian mathematics and physics. Less well known, by contrast, is that Léon Bloch had a small part in the reception of the theory of relativity in France. He was the first, in 1817, to give a detailed and technically, next slide please, to give a detailed and technically accurate account of the general theory of relativity in an article that appeared in the Revue Générale des Sciences. And in 1822, he published the text of a lecture on the principle of relativity given in November of the previous year, in which he insisted on the experimental character of the theory of relativity. In the 30s, moreover, Bloch would also deal with quantum mechanics, but we can stop here and limit ourselves to mentioning that when we read at the very end of Reichenbach's article, when we read traduit par Monsieur Bloch, well, that name does not appear by pure chance, and reader of the time is certainly said more than it does to readers today. This is in short the story better of the pre-story of the article of Reichenbach. And now he made us rest. Next slide. At the end of July 1922, Reichenbach received the 4 copies of the issue of the Revue Philosophique containing his article, whose title, we repeat again, sound as La signification philosophique de la théorie de la relativité. It was a title certainly not chosen by accident, and the final lines of the article seemed even alluding to a polemical intent toward the French philosophical milieu, in which Bergson's voice had entered, overbearing into discussion of the theory of relativity. Quotation, next slide. In our times, it has been the physicists and mathematicians who make the philosophy, not the official philosophers. And Reichenbach added, it seemed to be the nature of the human spirit that the handling of particular concrete problems brings closer together the enigma of knowledge with all the abstract reflection on the conceivable phenomena of its very conception. At any rate, what is important are the first line of this quotation. I repeat again, in our times, it has been the physicists and mathematicians who make the philosophy, not the official philosophers. Accordingly, the point on which Reichenbach strongly insists is that, examining the theory of relativity, one cannot fail to refer constantly to its philosophical background. Next slide. We have mistaken everything that is found in the work of Einstein if it is taken only as constructing a physical theory. Science, it was even cognizant that the introduction of a new theory always involves philosophical discovery. This is, so to speak, the program of Reichenbach's scientific philosophy. For Reichenbach, it is particularly through the philosophical analysis of the concept of space and time that Einstein was able to construct relativistic physics. As can be seen first of all from the conceptual analysis Einstein has developed of the notion of simultaneity. And in this regard, one could be tempted to add that here Reichenbach is really very far from what Bergson had argued while discussing with Einstein at the Sorbonne on April 6, 1922. But once these premises have been set, it cannot be said that in the early 60th page of his essay, Reichenbach merely provides a popularized exposition of the theory of relativity. On the contrary, we are in the presence of a complex reconstruction that, to tell the truth, only an experienced reader is able to fully understand. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why this important article has left little trace in the French discussion of the theory of relativity. We will limit ourselves here to highlighting only two aspects. First, and slides, Reichenbach dealt extensively on the a priori problem. As he had already argued in his 1920 book, Relativity and a priori knowledge, the crucial point here is the distinction between two meanings of a priori. A priori as the predicted and necessary character of knowledge, and a priori as the constitutive condition of some principles of scientific experience. Reichenbach writes, summarizing his position already expressed in the 1920 book. Quotation: abandoning the first sense of a priori, the predictive character, does not force us to also abandon the second sense. To the contrary, the study of modern physics shows that it always makes use of constitutive principles. We must simply get used to the idea that these constitutive principles can be well grounded without the pretension of declaring them to be eternally valid. This is the key point, the core argument of Reichenbach's so-called relativization of a priori in the early 20s in the light of Einstein's theory of relativity. By 1922, as 2 years after the publication of the book I have just quoted, by 1922, however, something had changed in Reichenbach's position, especially as a result of a close debate which Schlick had led Reichenbach to rethink, at least in part, its original epistemological stance. Reichenbach had been persuaded by Schlick in the course of an epistolary discussion in the autumn of 1920 that the only consequent way to separate the constitutive moment from the apodictic necessity moment of the a priori, also the two main aspects of a priori, constitutive aspect and apodicticity or necessity a priori, is to assimilate it, to say the a priori, to a convention in the sense of Poincaré's conventionalism. From this point of view, the project of the relativization for the a priori is no longer developed within the legacy of the Kantianism and took the path that would lead Reichenbach to the marriage with geometric conventionalism, which rejects a prioristic argument in the philosophy of space and yet recognizes that the geometric form of a body is neither an absolute datum of experience, but depends on a definition of a priori coordination that establishes the rules of congruence valid within a given geometric system. The dismissal from the Kantian synthetic a priori does take place by overcoming any constitutive function of it, and emphasizes, against the belief in the absolute character of human reason, the changing role from time to time of the principles of scientific knowledge, which are obtained by empirical means and are subject to continuous regulation by experience. And this is the stance that Reichenbach assumed in the course of the 20s, in particular his famous book on the concept of space and time in 1928. This is a long road which leads Reichenbach from early neo-Kantianism through the discussion with Schlick to his later conventionalistic stance at the end of the 20th years. The article of 1922 is, so to speak, a station along this road. The second point I will stress is the following. This gradual shift in perspective is evident just with regard to such a crucial issue as conventionalism. The crucial point is conventionalism. And this crucial point emerges already in the article in French in 1922. For Reichenbach, next slide, it must be made clear that the new concept of space and geometry that Einstein elaborated in the general theory of relativity leads to the ultimate disavowal of the Kantian conception of geometry. And accordingly, in his French article, he writes, quotation, "The solution of the problem of space is therefore found only in this conception we call conventionalism, and which goes back to Helmholtz and Poincaré. But one has no right to abuse this conception in order to diminish the importance of Einstein's discovery." This is a very important quotation where we find a lot of argument and issues. First of all, conventionalism in the sense of both Helmholtz and Poincaré, and this is already a problem. I mean, if Helmholtz and Poincaré can be, so to say, married in sharing this kind of conventionalism a la Poincaré. And second argument, the idea that conventionalism a la Poincaré not diminish, to quote Reichenbach himself, the importance of Einstein's discovery. All this means that not only Kant's conception of Euclidean geometry as an a priori condition of an experience must be abandoned, but that more generally, Reichenbach endorses here a position that did not still share in his 1921 essay on the discussion, The Theory of Relativity, where in fact he pointed out that the label conventionalism did not seem to him to be suitable to mark his relativization of the a priori. Next slide. I am quoting from the article of 1921 published in Logos, der gegenwärtige Stand der Realitätsdiskussion, which is, to my mind, the last step of Reichenbach's neo-Kantianism and the first step toward conventionalism. But the first step is not to find in 1921, but in the French article. In the article of 1921, Reichenbach writes, in the first place, conventionalism does not recognize, as Kant did, that these conventions determine the concept of object, that a particular thing or rule is defined only by their help and not by reality alone. Secondly, the term convention overemphasizes the arbitrary elements in the principle of knowledge. As we have shown, their combination is no longer arbitrary. Also, in this passage, we find Reichenbach, who is still against conventionalism. He means he believes that conventionalism is not in order with the proper significance of Kant's a priori as constitutive function. This is the reason why the article in French of 1922 is so important in order to grasp Reichenbach's intellectual development and his road from Kant to Poincaré. We cannot go any further into this question, but at least we can ask, what, if any, was the reaction of Reichenbach's French colleagues when faced with this complex play of parts between Kant, Einstein, Poincaré, and Schlick? All we really know is that Schlick immediately read Reichenbach's French paper and expressed his full appreciation in a letter to him dated August 15, 1922. I quote from this letter. Unfortunately, the old PowerPoint does not contain this quotation. I will try to read it slowly. Also, in this letter, Schlick writes, "As in all of your writings, the argument is of uncommon logical clarity, and you have succeeded in finding extremely apt formulations. Everything you say seems to me not only factually incontestable, but also brilliantly expressed." End of quotation. And in his answer to Schlick, composed just the day after, Reichenbach, for his part, stressed that by writing in the essay, he had to keep in mind, in particular, Schlick's remarks about the evidence of geometry. Reichenbach's stance in this regard is clearly formulated in a passage of this French article, worthy indeed to be quoted at length. Another quotation that is not reproduced in the present PowerPoint, but I try again to read it slowly. Also, in this passage of the French article of 1922, Reichenbach says, "It happens that mathematicians who are well trained in non-Euclidean geometry say that this geometry becomes increasingly intuitive to them. And those who work with the theory of relativity also move away from the ordinary argument, saying that the intuitive character of Euclidean geometry is only a product of habit, and that non-Euclidean geometry can, little by little, become intuitive as well. Here, we bring ourselves to yet another point of view. I would like to show that it is an error to believe that one of the two geometries, the Euclidean alone, is intuitively representable, while the non-Euclidean is essentially counterintuitive." End of the quotation. In this sense, Reichenbach significantly recognized that this epistemological view is essentially in accordance with Schlick's own position. And I quote again from the article, from the French article, Reichenbach writes, "The non-Euclidean concepts can just as well be associated with the intuition as can the Euclidean concepts, because the Euclidean intuition is also a combination of intuition concepts. The point of view that there exists no pure intuition was for the first time clearly put forward by Schlick." End of quotation. This question is, however, more complicated than it appears from the brief account we have presented here, and would request a deeper look in the discussion between Schlick and Reichenbach in this extraordinary time of philosophical debates on Einstein's theory of relativity. But at this point, we should leave Paris and go to Vienna and Berlin. An exciting journey, which unfortunately we don't have time to undertake here. And I came now to some concluding remarks. Next slide. Oh no, it's too. We have time, sorry. 15 years after the article published in the Revue Philosophique, Reichenbach was invited by the Société Française de Philosophie to take part as guest of honor in a meeting on causality and induction that took place on June 5, 1937. Also, 15 years after the article on Einstein's theory of relativity. The eminent guest, then exiled in Istanbul, was introduced by Leon Brunswick, who emphasized that Reichenbach was the famous author of the 1922 article on Einstein's theory of relativity. Since then, Brunswick remarked, quote, "We have become accustomed to learning a great deal from Reichenbach's contributions." Brunswick added that Reichenbach had been the best spokesman of his generation for the impulses he had made to a closer alliance between science and philosophy, or more precisely, between a young science and a young philosophy. Brunswick's homage to Reichenbach came at a time when logical empiricism and the Vienna Circle had begun to take root in France. But at least throughout the 20s, in reality, the influence of Reichenbach's 1922 essay had been decidedly marginal. Despite the publication of Maurice Schlick's book Espace et Temps dans la physique contemporaine in 1929, translated into French by Maurice Solovey, the old friend of Einstein, Reichenbach's and Einstein's attempt to influence the French debate on the new physics remained largely unsuccessful. To be more precise, it would only be in the early 30s that more solid contacts between Reichenbach and French philosophy of science would begin to be established, thanks mainly to intellectual exchanges with Louis Rougier, who became, so to speak, Reichenbach's, but to some extent also agent in France. As Rougier wrote to Reichenbach on November 24, 1931, quotation, "The common ambition was to faire triompher l'idée d'une philosophie fondée sur la science dont l'offensive bergsonienne et néo-thomiste en France a détourné les esprits." Also, battle against Bergson and his influence in order to establish a new kind of philosophy, a scientific philosophy, inspired of Reichenbach logical empiricism and, in the sense of the Vienna Circle. It was the beginning of an historical phase, culminating later in the Paris Congresses of 1935 and 1937, dedicated to scientific philosophy and the unity of science, in a very different context, however, than that of the early 20s. Even to Reichenbach's other topics, first and foremost probabilities as well as induction, occupied now his agenda, and the extraordinary discussion on the theory of relativity that held those research France in 1822 seemed to belong to the past. This is not replaced, though, concluding moral from all this, but as is sometimes the case in the history of philosophy or science, a minor episode can shed new light on later conceptual developments or on the missed path that as historians we can retrace with a more detached attitude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Professor Massimo. And we will proceed straightforwardly to comments by Professor Ernesto Justi.
Thank you very much, Professor Massimo, for your talk. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, hearing you. I've learned a lot from your books and your articles. My aim here will not be to debate Professor Ferrari's paper, rather to make some comments that I hope will help to broaden the context of this research.
Sorry, I hear not so well. There is some resonance. Sorry, but it is important that I...
Now, are you hearing better?
Yes, a little better, yeah.
Okay. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here hearing Professor Ferrari, from whose books and articles I've learned a lot. My aim here will not be to debate or oppose Professor Ferrari's paper, rather to make some comments that I hope will help to broaden the context of this research by highlighting some of the characteristics of French philosophy at the moment of the episodes explored in this conference. This, I hope, will help me to formulate in the end some questions to Professor Ferrari. For the last years, I've been reading 19th century French philosophy in order to understand what I call the Parisian parting of the ways. That is, the historical road that led to the peculiar identity of contemporary French philosophy, which is conventionally seen as the most radical example of continental philosophy with all its idiosyncrasies. One thing importantly highlighted in your talk is that it was not always so, and in particular, it was not so in the beginning of the 20th century. The scientific philosophes, as they were called, or sometimes also the reflexive rationalists, as they were also called, like Couturat, Brunswick, Millot, Tannery, Barré, and many others, were not only in direct dialogue with his European counterparts, but also pursued similar interests, with similar approaches and a similar approximation between philosophy and the physical and natural sciences. My guiding question could be formulated in this research, half jokingly, but also half not, as one about the Frenchness of French contemporary philosophy. When did it become so French and so separated of, for instance, German and British philosophy at the same time? It's a natural question for me, but one for which I could not find an answer in the available literature. Although a still working hypothesis, I'm convinced that this situation is the result of a process that, on the one hand, must be traced back at least to the first half of the 19th century, and on the other, a situation that will rapidly happen in the 30s of the last century. I mean, in the decade of the 30s in France, we see let's say the decline of the presence of the group that I quoted that were involved in Einstein and Reichenbach episodes, and will soon be that French philosophy becomes dominated by people like Hippolyte Courgève, and after that the phenomenologists like Levinas, Sartre, etc. And of course, Bergson would be the only name that will, let's say, traverse the 20th century French philosophy from this beginning of the 20th century. After that, it seems that the separation is already effectuated if we look at French philosophy during the Second World War and after. In the 60s, with the exception of Bergson, all the participants of the Reichenbach episode of 1922, or let's say the members of the French delegation to the 1930 Davos Congress, were already forgotten or even looked down. Foucault, in the Archaeology of Knowledge, for instance, writes to the effect that an archaeology of natural sciences could be done, but that it would not foster any kind of general philosophical progress. The focus was now on other things. French philosophy was definitely distanced from the natural sciences and mathematics and totally immersed in a dialogue with history, psychology/psychoanalysis, literature and literary theory, and Marxist political economy. In my comments to Professor Russo-Krauss in this meeting, I've already pointed out some of the main tenets of this history. I will add some other aspects to that history here. In the first half of the 19th century, we can identify some trends that are specific to French philosophy in the context of European philosophy. First,
sorry, but is it interrupted?
Shouldn't be.
I lost some words. Huh?
Let's just get next. I will start again. I was quoting. I was saying that soon after the 1930s, French philosophy was definitely distanced from the natural sciences and mathematics and totally immersed in a dialogue with history, psychology/psychoanalysis, literature and literary theory, and Marxist political economy. In my comments to Professor Russo-Krauss, I've already pointed out some of the main tenets of this history. I will add some other aspects to that history here. In the first half of the 19th century, we can identify some trends that are specific to French philosophy in the context of European philosophy. First, the French reception of Kant, unlike in Germany, for instance, put his emphasis not on thinking the factum of sciences, but rather on coping with the problem of freedom, of the freedom of man in a naturalistic worldview. That means that it was Kant's practical and not theoretical philosophy which first occupied French philosophers. Second point, the clash between Kantian positivism and the spiritualist current hindered, forbid a concrete dialogue between philosophy and the science, maybe paradoxically. Positivism, conceiving itself as scientifical, nevertheless was unable to promote a fruitful philosophical growth because in the long run saw itself as promoting an identification or even a reduction of philosophy to the natural sciences, not dissimilar to the one proposed by the German materialists of the decade of the 60s of the 19th century. In the place of a philosophy of science or a theory of knowledge, the concrete result of positivism would be a philosophy built from the empirical science. Spiritualism, on the other hand, saw the sciences in a frame not dissimilar to that of the German idealists and its natural philosophy. This philosophy of nature, despite its name, is essentially a metaphysical position in relation to the universe that was conceived organically, spiritualistically, and dynamically, much more than a way to promote a concrete interaction between philosophy and science. Thirdly, the reform of higher education in the passage from the 18th to the 19th century, with the founding of institutions like the ENS, École Supérieure, the École Polytechnique, and also the Ministère of de l'Éducation nationale, contributed to an isolation between disciplines. Each one having now a particular setting and a particular place in the institutional and economical division of intellectual labor.
The situation will be altered, changed only after the 1850s, when a new generation of philosophers like Jules Latoyer, Étienne Vachereau, Ernest Renan, Hippolyte Taine, and Charles Renouvier would somewhat change the state of things. The publication of Renouvier Essai de critique générale, beginning in 1854, would at the same time broaden the field of interest in the reception of Kant and definitely incorporate what could be called a French version of the neo-Kantian spirit. Renouvier, while not excluding Kantian moral philosophy, would put epistemology and the natural and formal sciences back into the discussion and overcome the division between spiritualists and positivists. It must be noted, however, that unlike Germany, biology and psychology will have a role more prominent than physics or mathematics. And finally, in 1863, that was important, France reinstated the agrégation, the public exam for entry in the teaching career in philosophy, both for high schools and universities. And that was instrumental in reconciling natural sciences and philosophers. Philosophers like Paul Janet and Théodule Rigaud, which was quoted in the presentation, who worked not only in philosophy, but also in psychology, were the result of this change of type. This generation will be responsible for forming the subsequent generations, including the scientific philosophes, but also people like Garçon, Pouillet, Guyot, all of them representatives of this new moment in French philosophy. In the following years, we will see a renewed impetus in French philosophy, and the publication first of La Revue Philosophique de France et de l'Étranger, and after La Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale, will be instrumental in this moment. In the beginning, the first one was more inclined to promote, the first one, that is Revue de Métaphysique de Morale, was more inclined to promote a dialogue from the point of view of the foundations of mathematics and logic. One can think, for instance, about the lifelong fight between Couturat and Poincaré in the Revue de Métaphysique de Morale as an example, while the Revue Philosophique was more inclined to promote philosophical questions raised by psychology and physiology. After that, in the 20th century, this would not be exactly the case. The foundation of the Société Française de Philosophie in 1901 and the International Congresses of Philosophy from 1900 onwards can be seen as the result of this same impetus. This brief reconstruction aims to show that the first decades of the 20th century were an unique moment in the history of French philosophy that could not really be found nor before nor after that moment, and that would be quickly superseded. One final remark I would like to do here concerns the place of Bergson in this scenario. Although what can be called a rock star in French philosophy, the histories about Beckett Olitorians and his feminine and bourgeois following are well known, he must be seen not as the towering or the single figure in this moment, but rather as another interlocutor in the philosophical panorama. The emphasis on his figure, and eventually also in Poincaré's figure, as defined the first decades of the 20th century reception of Einstein and indeed of French philosophy in general, are surely one-sided and do not tell the complete history. Your talks have put this in evidence. To conclude those brief remarks, I would like to sort out one particular figure to briefly illustrate the state of affairs in the beginning of the 20th century. I will choose Léon Brongeville, not only for his general importance, but also because he was very present in your talk. But pretty much the same thing could be done with, let's say, Maillarson, Aberré, Millot, Tannery, and others, representatives of this philosophical zeitgeist in France. Brongeville was a disciple of Émile Bottou, a Kantian scholar and historian of philosophy, who incorporated what he called, a critique of scientific knowledge, and quote, to the philosophical endeavor. True to his master, Reichenbach considered that science and philosophy go together. He defended a deflationary view of historical philosophical categories like spiritualism, atheism, and so on, in the sense that they are useful, but not really true. His reflexive idealism, sometimes called also critical idealism, and his confidence on the unity of knowledge led him to try a synthesis between science and philosophy, and to build many developments of the different sciences in the 20th century as pointing in one and the same direction, because the biology, chemistry, all of them pointed to the same direction, to the same evolution of thought. This is very explicit in the case of the reception not only of relativity, as you showed us, but also quantum mechanics, which he, Reichenbach, saw as confirming the same epistemological thesis, namely that science is the result not of inductive observation of reality, but of the expression of human mind in striving to create comprehensive categories adequate to describe the convergent results of all of the science. Although Europe developed the same themes until his death, his influence, like the one of all or most of the protagonists of the story you told us, with the exception of Delton again, was almost none. When he was quoted and read after the 30s, it would be to be criticized, for instance, by Sartre. What I try to do here is to show that we have in France, around 1922, a rather unique conjunction of what could be called material and objective conditions that could not be seen some decades before, and would rapidly vanish, drowned by new developments of French philosophy in a very different direction. In the context of what I've tried to expose here, I would like to present some questions to Professor Massimo. The first one is purely historical or factual. You emphasized that the change of mind of Reichenbach in 22 in respect to his paper of 1920 and attributed this change of mind mainly to the contact and dialogue with Schlick. But in 1921, Einstein published his famous text on geometry and experience, which developed some of the philosophical aspects of his theory. Many observations by Reichenbach in the article of 22 seem to recall maybe the Einsteinian approach presented there in the geometry and experience. For instance, his insistence that resistance against relativity must come mainly from its conceptual aspect, that is, its proper philosophical consequences, rather than from the physical success of the theory, which was undeniable. Did Reichenbach read this text in the interval of 21-22? Was any direct influence and evidence of this? So, for instance, Schlick's presentation of relativity was written before the publication of geometry and experience. My second question would be this one. As you touched upon in your talk, there are seemingly some concrete Kantian overtones in Reichenbach's article, not only in the discussion of space and time, but also in the general approach in which a priori principles are said to have a role in scientific theory. These ideas will be toned down in the later writings by Reichenbach. I think that, given the more recent research on the Vienna Circle and logical positivism, we must admit a strong link between logical positivism and, for instance, Marburger neo-Kantianism, than in the cases of Schlick or Carnot, for instance. Could we point a similar influence in the case of Reichenbach, and in the positive case, by which concretely by how it was done? Finally, I would like to hear some words from Professor Massimo some comments about the French context I tried to describe and how it can be related to the interactions described in your article. Concretely, I'm worried about the disappearance of that scientific philosophy tradition just a few years after the event we touched upon. I mean, the many participants continue to do philosophy, but this philosophy does not resonate as it resonated before, and does not occupy a proper place in the academic philosophy, in French academic philosophy, in the subsequent year. I believe that an adequate history of this moment is still to be written, and that it will help to understand, again, the Parisian parting of the ways and the nature of the following developments in French philosophy and its place in European world philosophy in general. Those were my comments and my questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to you for your question and for wide framework in which also the debate about the relative ought to be posed. I am not sure to have rightly understood the last question because I hear not well all what you have said. I try to answer to your question, and first and foremost, I would like to stress that I totally agree what the wide historical, philosophical framework that you have depicted at the beginning of your comments. I totally agree with the idea that French scientific philosophy played a great role in the early 20th century, and I believe that the standard view of logical empiricism, the inner circle, and even scientific philosophy has ignored or neglected for a long time this French connection. I think that the scientific philosophy is not identical with logical empiricism or Werner Circle. Scientific philosophy, a wider moment in which French philosophy, French epistemology, historical epistemology, played a great role. Also, I am totally in accord with you, and in particular when you have stressed the importance of protagonists such as Boutroux or Brunswick that were very influential until the 20s, perhaps the 30s, and then these Michael Friedman said, the passing of the way at the done has done that the history of French philosophy is totally is for a long time totally forgotten. But the real history is another history. This is a well-known maxima of historical inquiry. And the real history is that in the between the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, French philosophy of science and French history of science together was very influential and had marked the way of scientific philosophy. Also, I am totally agree. I totally agree with your wide presentation, and I would like to discuss with you about single points you have quickly stressed in your exposition. For instance, in what regards the reception of Kant philosophy in the early 19th century and the difference with regard to German context. Okay, it is also okay, and I am since long time well convinced that the history of French scientific philosophy is an history which is worthy to be talked and described and investigated more precisely. Your three questions. The first question is the question about
the geometric experience of Einstein.
the question about Reichenbach geometrie und Erfahrung. Okay, it must be said that it is a very complicated question. While for an aspect, Schlick has attempted to give a strictly conventionalistic lecture interpretation of Einstein's statements in this famous conference. But Einstein's in Geometrie und Erfahrung, Geometry and Experience, was not so deeply connected and committed to Poincaré's conventionalism. He criticized him. And I don't know if you know the book of Thomas Reichmann about the linear relativity.
Yeah.
In this book, you find a wonderful chapter about the interpretation of geometry and experience by Schlick, Reichmann, and others protagonists of the debate. And I agree with Reichmann that the conference, this lecture Einstein delivered in January 1921, was not in a declaration, so to speak, of conventionalism, but a debate with Poincaré and an attempt to correct Poincaré's conventionalism in the light of the fact that the theory of relativity had radically changed the terms itself of the question posed by Poincaré. Schlick was very sensitive to this conventionalistic possible interpretation of Einstein, and this sensibility Schlick manifested by reading and quoting Einstein's lecture as a great influence on Reichenbach himself. And in the article of 1922, and also in the French article, Reichenbach refers briefly to Einstein's geometry and experience. And it seems to me that Reichenbach was not aware, or no, best to say, that Reichenbach was aware that Einstein was not strictly conventionalist in the sense of Poincaré, but he was also convinced that this way of interpreting the theory of relativity in the sense of Helmholtz on Poincaré conventionalism was the right road in order to leave the heritage of Kantian philosophy of science itself. It's a crossroad, very important, a very delicate point, and I think that at this time, also we are speaking of the first month of 1922, Reichenbach was under the influence of Schlick, strongly under the influence of Schlick. And this is an aspect of the question. The other aspect is that, in my mind, Reichenbach was never so anti-Kantian and only strictly conventionalist as the standard view as long time stated. Even in the 1928 book on the space and time theory, Reichenbach, in the first part, defends the concepts of conventions in the sense of geometrical convention, in which we can still find, so to speak, some trace of the old idea of a priori as constitutive principles. And in this sense, it's a very complicated question. And I think that Reichenbach was, for an for a part, it was too slick, but in the end, it was never so Schlickian as the standard view has long time suggested, or better to say, so conventionalist as the standard view suggests. The question is even the question you have rightly emphasized, how we can read and interpret Reichenbach's stance towards Einstein's geometry and experience. This is a key point. I am fully in agreement with you, and I believe that the right way is that which has been traced by Reichmann in his book on the range of relativity. This is said against a misinterpretation of Reichenbach's road from Kantianism to conventionalism as a straightforward road in which Reichenbach was in the early 20s still committed to Kantianism, and then was strictly committed to conventionalism. I believe that the history is more complicated, and we have to individuate and to investigate single passages in this road. And the exchange of letters between Schlick and Reichenbach, I will notice only some passages of this letter, are very interesting in this sense. Okay, also an open question, but I would say Reichenbach in 1822 is no longer the Kantian of the 1920s, but is at the same time not the conventionalist who had endorsed a kind of Einstein's conventionalism. This is the first question. The second question was about Reichenbach and neo-Kantianism. I am not sure to have good understood the point. You say
no, I was just stressing that. Well, we have just about Carnap and Schlick. We can trace. We know that what were the roads that led from neo-Kantianism, the Marburger full approach, and to them. Is the history of the relationship between Reichenbach and neo-Kantianism is the same? We pull the parallel. Because I'm asking this for my ignorance of Reichenbach. That was more an explanatory question. I'm interested in knowing if there are studies.
I don't understand. It is quite impossible to understand. Sorry, but can you try to speak not direct?
I was just asking about the relationship between Reichenbach and neo-Kantianism.
Yes.
We have this is known. This is already studied. I think in the case of Carnap and Schlick. I was wanting to know if there are some similar studies in the case of Reichenbach and what they tell us, what they show us. This was the question.
I have changed the room. I hope to hear. Okay. Sorry, I have changed the room in order to attempt to have a better reception. Okay.
And my third question was, given that the scientific philosophy in France quickly failed, do you have some thoughts on what prompted, what caused this situation, about the failure of the French philosophical, scientific philosophy to continue and endure until more recently. That was the third question.
Can you hear us, Professor?
Yeah, I cannot understand what my colleague says. The question was about Reichenbach, Schlick, Carnap, and Kantianism. This is a long story which has been told in the last time many times and very well from by scholars such as Friedman, Richardson, and so on. And your question is about.
My last question was, do you have some thoughts about the failure of French scientific philosophy to endure?
Okay.
That was just the question.
My point was at the end of my talk, if contemporaries of Reichenbach and Schlick in French, such as, for instance, Braunschweig and Meyerson, could really and deeply understand the terms of the question. They were acquainted with Einstein theory of relativity, were acquainted in general with the German philosophical milieu, but I think that the subtle questions regarding the relativization of a priori were for features such as just Braunschweig or Meyerson not so clear. The reason is the following. For instance, Braunschweig has, so to speak, an image of Kant's philosophy of science and mathematics that is, for on the one side, akin to the German neo-Kantian image, but on the other side, there is some features that are typical of French philosophical milieu, and to say the complex with the formal is the French spiritualism, which in some ways has constituted a difficulty in order to understand the way in which Cassirer or even Reichenbach intended to relativize a priori. There is a lack of philosophical communication and terminology in this sense. This was a question that I posed at the end of my talk. And this is how I think this is one of the reasons why scientific philosophy has experienced this a kind of failure in the 20th and the 30s. That is a very complicated question, a very complicated history.
Thank you very much, Professor, for very enlightening.
Okay, now we can have some questions from audience. I just would like to ask you, if you're interested in maybe posing questions, please come here because of the camera and the microphones. Okay, so Professor Massimo, I think it's that. Thank you for your very illuminating conference, and we hope that maybe next time we can have you in person here So thank you so
Yeah.
very much.
Thank you to you, and apologize again for also for the difficulty to hear your question. We can write and we can exchange our opinions, and I would like to send to you Mr. Giusti, a paper on Brunswick theory of relativity, which I have just finished in Italian and also in French, and I hope you will be interested in reading this.
Yes, I'm very interested. I will send you an email. With
Yes.
my contact. Okay?
Yes, we have to exchange our works and our papers and so on. Very, 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 very nice. Thank you again for all, and good afternoon.
Bye bye. Thanks.